Hi everyone, I'm Lizeth and I'll be taking the position that General Iron represents a form of environmental racism.
Hi everyone, I'm Manny, and I will be taking the position that the relocation of General Iron is not a form of environmental racism. So today we will be doing our debate and create covering environmental racism in Chicago. In today's debate, we will be discussing General Iron, a scrap metal operation that had long been operating in Lincoln Park before attempting to relocate to Chicago's southeast side in 2021. But first, I wanted to ask Lizette, could you explain what environmental racism is and why it might apply to a city like Chicago?
Yeah, of course. Environmental racism refers to the policies and practices that disproportionately burden low-income minority communities with exposure to environmental hazards, contaminants, and climate risks. Such policies can include heightened exposure to lead in drinking water and the city planning decisions to place incinerators and hazardous waste disposal sites near neighborhoods predominantly populated by communities of color. Chicago has a long history of segregation and continues to be one of the most segregated cities in the US. The realities of this segregation include multiple impacts on the quality of life and resources garnered for certain parts of the city, including exposure to certain environmental hazards. The effects of environmental racism are especially apparent in Chicago's South and West Side neighborhoods, which have historically consisted of largely Black and Latino populations. So I'll turn to Manny now and ask if you can explain more about General Iron and some of the backlash the company has been receiving.
So yeah, General Iron was a metal shredding company operating for decades in Chicago's wealthy Lincoln Park neighborhood. After years of complaints about pollution, like airborne metal particles, noise, and odors, the city negotiated to move General Iron's operations. But instead of shutting it down, the company planned to relocate to the southeast side, a much poorer, mostly Black and Latino area already heavily burdened by industrial pollution. Many Southeast Side residents protested the move, arguing that it was a clear example of environmental racism. Activists pointed out that this decision continued a long history of Chicago pushing polluting industries into low-income and minority neighborhoods. They also argued that the Southeast Side already faced major health issues like high rates of asthma and respiratory illnesses. The controversy drew national attention, and in 2021, after hunger strikes, protests, and pressure from federal authorities, including the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Chicago eventually denied General Iron's permit to operate on the southeast side. Now, Lizeth, I was wondering if you could explain more about these pollutants present in the southeast side and why the residents are concerned.
Yeah, I would definitely argue that residents should be concerned about their exposure to certain pollutants. And I would go as far as to say they have every right to be protesting General Iron because of how serious these threats are. For starters, the burden of air pollution is more prevalent in the west and south side areas compared to the rest of the city. The 2020 Air Quality and Health Report for the City of Chicago found that areas in the south and west side, especially those bisected by major highways and industrial areas, are starkly overburdened with high exposure to concentration or with high concentrations of air pollutants. Air pollution in Chicago typically consists of things like exposure to ground level ozone, fine particulate matter, and nitrogen oxides. These pollutants pose a significant threat to health because they're associated with conditions like asthma, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and even premature death. Fine particulate matter is of particular concern here because the particles are so small that they can penetrate the lungs and reach the bloodstream, where they can affect other organs and tissues in the body. This area of Chicago is already pretty vulnerable, being among the country's top neighborhoods in exposure to things like diesel fumes and cancer risk from airborne substances. And even since 2014, the EPA has fined over 75 countries for violating the Clean Air Act in this region. Obviously, these concerns are pretty substantial, but I'm still curious about why the south side of Chicago was considered more advantageous place for the company to relocate to.
Yeah, so I think it's important to know that General Iron was pressured to leave Lincoln Park because of massive gentrification and economic redevelopment. Lincoln Park's property value skyrocketed, and the city had heavy industry from wealthy areas. Relocating to an existing industrial zone on the southeast side aligned with decades-old zone maps that designated this area for manufacturing. The southeast side, particularly the Calumet Industrial Corridor, has been a hub for heavy industry since the late 19th century. This area was strategically developed due to its access to transportation networks like the Calumet River and railroads, facilitating industrial growth. This points to urban land use policies, a structural social determinant rather than direct racial discrimination by General Iron. The southeast side was already designated an industrial corridor long before General Iron's relocation plan. Environmental justice concerns should challenge zoning practices over decades, but blaming one company ignores the real structural problem: historic zoning decisions that prioritize industry over resident well-being. General Iron followed legally approved zoning, not a racialized targeting of communities of color. Now, this is just one perspective, but I was wondering if you could explain how other activists and community members view General Iron's relocation.
Yeah, I do think you make an important point about how the relocation of the plant is driven by various factors, and it's not necessarily beneficial to pinpoint blame onto one company. Like I said before, Chicago has a long history of segregation of its neighborhoods, and this definitely has tangible effects in terms of health outcomes. A recent study found that among US cities, Chicago had the largest gap in life expectancy across its neighborhoods, with residents of wealthier neighborhoods having an average life expectancy approximately 30 years higher than those living in neighborhoods of lower SES. Although these disparities in average life expectancy are more directly correlated with neighborhood location than exposure to environmental hazards and contaminants, I think it is difficult to analyze the underlying cause for such a wide gap without considering the lived environment of different sectors of the city. In thinking about the social determinants of health, we can kind of see how neighborhood and built environment, and maybe even social and community context play a role here. Policies like the one you described make it appealing for industries to concentrate by certain neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods may have already received less resources due to their demographics. So although I do see your point, I would say the General Iron case represents a form of environmental racism because such policies do still kind of fall into that definition of environmental racism by upholding patterns of the South and West sides bearing the burden of exposure to environmental contaminants. Would you argue that these actions are the fault of individual companies or due to greater systemic outcomes?
I think it's crucial to distinguish individual company effects from systemic outcomes. The Southeast side suffers poor health outcomes because of deep economic marginalization, underinvestment in infrastructure, poor healthcare access, and lack of political clout. These are the real social determinants of health at play, and they have existed independently of General Iron. Focusing all blame on one company oversimplifies the deep-rooted historical inequities we must address. Some will argue that moving a polluting facility into a minority neighborhood is automatically racist. Environmental racism is about patterns and systems, not just single actions. To fix these injustices, we must challenge systemic zoning, disinvestment, and power structures, not scapegoat companies complying with city policy. Holding the entire burden on General Iron distracts from real sustainable solutions. And it's not just General Iron at fault. Aren't there any other examples of environmental racism in Chicago?
That's a good point. Yeah, one example that comes to mind is exposure to lead in our water. A study investigating lead-contaminated tap water in Chicago between 2016 and 2023 found that Black and Hispanic populations had a higher risk of lead exposure, but lower rates of household lead testing. Lead is a powerful neurotoxin, and young children are especially vulnerable to the effects of lead exposure, as it has been linked to learning disabilities and developmental delays. Lead exposure continues to be a major concern for Chicago because we have the most lead service lines out of any other city. I think this also presents another form of environmental racism and another way for us to consider the social determinants when we consider things like how fast these service lines are being replaced or who is aware about testing kits and health impacts. Overall, I would say that environmental racism is prevalent in Chicago when we look at the disproportionate exposure of these hazards. The fight against General Iron is justified, and that I think it represents not just a fight against an individual company, but against city policy and practices that have led to serious health outcomes for the South and West sides.
While you make valid points that environmental racism must be addressed, the General Iron case reflects broader systemic failures in urban planning, economic inequality, and governance. not solely intentional discrimination by one company. True environmental justice requires systemic reform, not selective blame.
That's the end of our debate. Thank you for listening.